Hello and welcome. My name's Tom Stapledon, and I've got another one of my talks and slideshows here on behalf of the Friends of Williamson's Tunnels. This time I'm going to talk about a gentleman who wasn't even born during Joseph Williamson's era, but he has a very strong connection with Joseph Williamson and also the set of buildings behind my head here on my screen, which Joseph Williamson put up in Paddington around 1836 to 1840. And you'll understand what the connection is as we go along. So this is our man, William Boote. William Boote, the grocer of Liverpool. Before I go any further, I'd like to say a couple of things. First of all, I want to acknowledge all the help given to me here by Lynn Mills, because she did an enormous amount of research work into William Boote and his family and his background and his connections. And everything I know about him has come from that research work. Secondly, I'd like to apologize because I really do like my slideshows to be full of slides and something interesting on screen to look at. This time I don't have very many pictures to put in front of you and rather a lot more words. And in fact, I've got to apologize again because a lot of these words are not fixed in my head. They're not things I can personally remember fully. So I'm going to be doing a fair bit of reading from pieces of paper here and leaving you to stare at a screen with a single slide for far too long, I would imagine. But I'll do the best I can. This was a talk I gave to the Friends of Williamson's Tunnels monthly members meeting in May 2023. So this man, William Boote, those of you who come to the monthly meetings will probably have heard his name mentioned before. William Boote, according to Lynn's research, was born around 1846 in Edge, near Malpas, Cheshire, into a farming family. His mother died when he was just 2 years old, and the family later moved to Shropshire, where his father carried on as a farmer. By the time of the 1861 census, William was still living there with his family, aged 14. It's not known exactly when he came to Liverpool, but by 1870, he was married here at the age of 22 to Catherine Ann MacDougall, who was aged 17, and they married at St. Augustine's in Walton. Their son Donald was born that year. The 1871 census places the family at 116 Paddington, along with his in-laws, when he is listed as being a grocer. Now, this set of buildings on Paddington, 120 to 126, eventually came through a number of changes in the numbering system in Paddington, probably as a result of more buildings going up in the street, in between existing ones, maybe, and the numbers having to be changed, which makes life very, very confusing for us in trying to identify who was in what building. Now, the 1871 census places the family at 116 Paddington, along with his in-laws, when he is listed as being a grocer for the first time. So boy from a farming family has ended up in Liverpool 22 years later and becomes a grocer. Not quite sure how that comes about. How's about he went and got a job working for a grocer in Malpas when he was a young boy, and he learnt all about the trade and then later thought, I could do that. Anyway, he moved to Liverpool and he became a grocer, and he was at 116 Paddington. I can't say that that was one of the Williamson buildings that you see here. He may have been further down the street and then moved later. In 1873, tragedy struck. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a bit. In 1872, a daughter, Annie, was born. But tragically, she was struck down that same year when Catherine died at just 20 years of age. In 1873, tragedy struck again when William lost both his children, Donald at the age of 2 years and 8 months, followed not long after by Annie at just 18 months of age. Both children and their mother are buried at St. Mary's Church, Edge Hill. This is just a stone's throw away from the Williamson buildings here in Paddington. I would imagine the most likely cause of death was probably cholera, because it was rife in inner city areas in those days. And it's very likely that that's what carried them away, or perhaps typhoid. The burial records show that the family were living at 108 Paddington. Well, we know that the street numbers have been altered more than once, so we don't know whether 108 and 116 are the same building or whether they have moved on the street. Impossible to tell. By 1874, William is known to have become a Freemason, and he's listed as a grocer. And in 1879, he was producing a local paper called the Edge Hill and District Illustrated Monthly Journal. We have, as it turns out, one of our volunteers found the monthly journal on the internet, I believe, and there were 12 bound copies, one for each month of 1879. No other copies have ever been found. There's no record of it in the Liverpool Records Office or in the libraries. This set of 12 bound copies may be the only ones in existence. But William Boote was obviously producing this himself. We know that he set up a printing press, and he was distributing it for 1 penny, I believe. Yes, price 1 penny. And he produced it for the 12 months from January 1879 until December 1879. Maybe he discontinued because it wasn't worthwhile doing. Who knows? But there's just these 12 copies, and you can see quite clearly that it is an advertising vehicle for his own business. And obviously he takes advertising from other businesses as well. I believe I haven't seen any other copies, just these 2 pages from front pages from different months of the journal. But I believe from somebody who has seen the inside of these things that for several months in a row, he was describing the story of Joseph Williamson. But I haven't seen that, unfortunately. By the time of the 1881 census, William was known to be a successful grocer, living and working on the premises at 108 Paddington. Again, we've got this confusion, 108 and 116. In the same year, he took a new bride, Fanny Jessie Boote, who we believe was probably his cousin, their fathers being brothers. By the time of the 1891 census, they'd moved to live at 52 Dean Road, Fairfield, and the business has obviously grown. I've traced this to the number 52 Dean Road, which is still there. Quite a large, posh house. So we've got to assume that by this time, 1891, Mr. Boote has become a really successful grocer. And the things I'm going to read to you in a few moments will back that up. He has several premises. He's now occupying 3 of the 4 shops at 120 to 124 Paddington. That's 3 out of the block of 4 built by Joseph Williamson. He's also using premises around the corner in Back Mason Street. And he has up to 9 shops around the town. So that business has really built up into a successful enterprise. And not just as a grocer, he's doing all sorts of things. In 1901, William became a local councillor for the Low Hill ward on Liverpool City Council, standing for the Conservative Party, eventually becoming an alderman and doing much good work on behalf of the local people in fighting waste and trying to bring down the rates. Let me turn my page. Although William sold the business by 1905, his retirement was given to helping people and not just being a councillor. He was devoted to his fellow citizens, especially the working classes. He was a member of the West Derby Wastelands Commission, which we know an awful lot about, and twice its chairman. As a member of the Electric Power and Lighting Committee, he supported the scheme to manufacture its own gas and electricity. This followed the proposition that Walton Workhouse should adopt the manufacture of gas for the lighting of their building. This was a success and a welcomed saving for the ratepayers. He was also on the Watch Committee. 16 years after his retirement, he was still actively giving his time to the welfare of the community. He supports local churches, but for some reason, he doesn't like to advertise this. some respects, that makes him rather similar in a way to Joseph Williamson, doing good for the local community, but doing it in a low-key way and not boasting about it. Both men have done the same sort of thing in their different ways. Williamson was giving work and employment and dignity and teaching trades to hundreds of unemployed men. And William Boote was doing his bit for charitable works in the community and supporting the churches, but doing it in a very low-key way and not blowing his own trumpet. He also seems to have had a little hobby all through his life. He left saucers in his garden, providing food and milk for all the stray cats. He would always have a treat in his pocket for any cat he came across. Apparently, he was known to have extra pockets sewn into his coat to hold cat nibbles. He was very much an animal lover. And William was also a member of the RSPCA and the RSPB. And in 1900, he was their secretary. He was known to feed the wild birds too in his garden. Now, we've had so many connections with William Boote during that 4-year period, well, longer than 4 years, all the many years we were exploring in the Paddington cellars, and then the final 4 years while we were digging out all those tons of rubble that filled them. And I would say that the William Boote is ever present while we were working there and ever present now. He occupied 3 of those 4 buildings, and he conducted an awful lot of business in bottling beers and wines and lemonade and all these things on the premises. And we come across things like this lovely flagon, this William Boote, Paddington, Liverpool, lets you know that this is in the right place. This is where it always belonged, and it's still there now. We dug that out of the spoil, and it's a reminder all the time that we're sharing that place with William Boote, or he shared it with us for so many years. In a way, it's not surprising that we found so many bottles and jars and things like this, and some of them with the name of William Boote, Paddington, Liverpool on. And it's always a pleasure to have found something that was actually belonging to the very buildings that we were digging out under. So William was bottling beers, bottling lemonades, wines, stout, and doing it either within these premises or just around the corner in Back Mason Street. So not surprising we found so many jars and bottles. And of course, there were tons and tons of broken bottles, which we had to shovel out. That was not much fun at all. And then when you come across something like this, W. Boote, Liverpool, that's a treat. This is a complete one of those cod bottles with the glass marble inside. And then we have the half imperial pint beer bottles. We found so many broken ones of these, but this is a lovely complete one. W. Boote, Liverpool. And when you look at this one closely, it's said trademark, apart from the name Boote, Liverpool, and a picture of a dog. I've got no idea really why he used a dog on his bottles, because he really was a cat lover. But there you go. That's a mystery we can't explain. We found lots of soda siphons as well. Mostly they were broken. But this one, although it's broken, it's complete enough. It's the only one I know of that actually had W. Boote, Liverpool on it. He must have filled thousands and thousands of soda bottles during his time occupying this building and running the machinery that you used for pumping the carbon dioxide in, along with the water or the lemonade and stuff. This rather interested me. This is a photograph, or rather a very poor photocopy of an old photograph from 1934, which I've had a copy of for many years, but I never looked at it very closely because it's such a poor copy. You can't really see the detail. It was only when I was putting this slideshow together, I put this one on screen and looked at it again. And I realized we're looking across Paddington into Back Mason Street, or rather, this is a little alley that opens out into Back Mason Street. Further along, it opens out into a street with houses on both sides. This is just the alleyway that leads into it. And the fact that that is Back Mason Street now reminds me that to the left, this has to be number 120 Paddington. You can't see much of it, but that is the first of the 4 in the block of buildings that Joseph Williamson put up: 120, 122, 124, and 126. And this is taken in 1934. Looking at it closely, I was able to make sure that I was on the right track here, because when it's blown up, you can see the number 118 on that shop. So that makes this 120 going up the hill. And looking at the name on there, I can tell you that it says May and Margaret, Ladies and Children's Hairdressing Salon. And then doing a cross-reference with this page from the Kelly's directory for 1938, where I've marked with a red arrow there, it says at 120 Paddington, Landrum and Smith ladies hairdressers. So May and Margaret must be Mrs. Landrum and Mrs. Smith. And I'd never realized this before, but it is actually a photograph of part of the frontage of the block of Williamson buildings. And I'd never realized it all the years I've had that photograph. And I think these two ladies, May and Margaret, must have been the very last occupiers of this building in the block, because in 1939, the whole block and everything else on the street, on this side of the street, was demolished. And that was the end of the Williamson buildings. Now, another rather nice piece of writing, I've actually read part of this before in one of my previous talks on somebody else or in general about Paddington. But this is a rather nice piece of writing that was turned up again by one of our volunteers. And it's a book called Liverpool of Today. It's a trade directory. And it says there, this is the inside front page, the maritime metropolis of the world, an epitome of results, businessmen and commercial interests, wealth and growth. So I believe it was probably one of those trade directories where you only got to have an entry if you paid for it. So you could use it as an advertising vehicle, but you had to pay for it. And reading this piece that I'm going to read to you now, I'm absolutely convinced that this lovely piece of Victorian advertising must have been written by William Boote himself, because I don't think anybody else would have blown up his business to such an extent as he did. He's really made the most of it. And I love the way the Victorians did their advertising. It seems very funny, but it's very nice piece of writing. So I'm going to read what's written. And there's only one page of it. It's been photographed, and this is all I have, just a photograph of these two pages. That page there on screen, and the other page, which is the write-up of William Boote's business. And I'm sure by William Boote, that's the top half, and that's the bottom half. So I'm just going to read this out to you while I leave this on screen. So, William Boote, dealer in tea, coffee, Italian goods, wines and spirits, ale and porter bottler, and mineral water manufacturer. 120, 122, 122A, and 124 Paddington. That is basically 3 out of the 4 Williamson buildings at the top of the street behind my head. W. Boote, also at Old Post Office Place and Back Mason Street. W. Boote is one of the most enterprising and successful men of business in Liverpool. In addition to the extensive premises occupied by him in Breck Road, he has 8 other large establishments in different parts of the city. His offices and wholesale sale room are at 120 Paddington, the building we were just looking at in the last photo. He has a very commodious coffee roasting and grinding warehouse at 122 Paddington, and tea blending rooms, warehouses, and country department at 122A. I think that's the upper floors in the same building. And 124 Paddington is the retail tea and coffee sale room. W. Boote has also a very large mineral water and ale and porter, wine and spirit bottling stores in Back Mason Street, just around the corner, as I showed you. His mineral water factory is one of the finest and most complete buildings of its kind in Liverpool. It is complete with the latest and best inventions in machinery that modern science can furnish for the production of all kinds of table waters and fruit champagnes in the purest form. Perfect cleanliness is secured, as the machinery is so arranged that every drop of water must of necessity be filtered. The interior of the machinery with which the water comes in contact is lined with pure silver, and the plungers of the pumps made of glass, in order to prevent the contamination or oxidation of the metal that takes place in the use of ordinary machinery. Ordinary machinery. Every article used in the manufacture of W. Boote's drinks is tested in the laboratory before being put into stock. This close attention to detail and general excellence of material and machinery is a prevailing characteristic in all W. Boote's establishments. His coffees are roasted and ground fresh every morning on the premises by patent process with the latest and most approved machinery, driven by steam power. Tea blending with W. Boote is a science. His stock in bond and duty paid is large and varied, comprising about 50 or 60 different kinds, which enables him to cater for the most fastidious. The increasing demand for his popular Ceylon blends has necessitated the erection of a motive power tea mixer, which thoroughly blends half a ton of tea in 1 minute. And during the entire process of transfer from the original packages of mixing in exact and judicious proportions and storing in specially constructed airproof bins, the tea is preserved from contact with the atmosphere and all handling rendered unnecessary. This is so over the top. This method ensures the thorough cleanliness and uniform flavor, and each leaf retains its original bloom, its strength, its flowery tip, and its fragrant freshness. Just a cup of tea. W. Boote holds the highest analytical testimony of the absolute purity and refreshing properties of his blends. In the cellars, which we shall allude to presently, is carried on the ale and porter bottling, and everything that science can produce and ingenuity suggest to secure thorough cleanliness is in operation. Right in the centre of the warehouse is the hoist, which works from the cellars to the top story. Now, we've actually seen evidence of that hoist at the back of the gantry where we go down into the basement of this house. Lost my place now. Within the last few months, W. Boote has put down printing machinery, which enables him to do his own printing, including labels, invoice forms, tea papers, window bills, and plain and fancy work of every description. Also, we may mention paper bags are made on this story in adjoining rooms, and I would imagine that Edge Hill Journal was also produced on that same printing press. The premises where all this business is carried on are very remarkable, being erected many years ago by rather an eccentric gentleman named Mr. Joseph Williamson, or as he was known to the neighbourhood, the King of Edge Hill, who took great delight in building arches underground. This building is 5 stories, and the cellars from the street parapet are as deep as the building is high, as we now know. Tiers of splendidly arched cellars, one over the other, exhibit skill of workmanship in masonry rarely met with. The roof is flat with an immense cistern which contains many tons of water and is always full, there being no way of running it out. The cistern rests on the centre wall of the building. Building is erected in one of the highest parts of the town, and from the roof, the whole of Liverpool and surrounding country can be seen. And on a clear day, it's a beautiful sight to look over Bidston Hill on the Cheshire side and see the vessels gliding majestically through the glassy waters of the Mersey. All Mr. Boote's premises are especially well fitted and stocked. He does a very large wholesale trade, and he has an excellent family connection, both of which are constantly increasing. He employs a very efficient staff and is certainly one of the most widely known and deservedly well patronised grocers and tea and coffee dealers in the city. The prompt and courteous attention that is given to all customers and the excellent order that is maintained in his many establishments cannot be too highly praised. I think that's a wonderful piece of writing, and I'm sure he's written all of that himself. The cistern on the roof of the buildings is a bit of a mystery. I can't make any sense of that, but I do believe personally that after the deep quarry, 60-foot deep, had been completed during Williamson's day and then abandoned, it was probably going to fill up with water, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if it didn't become the source for the water for his lemonade bottling. He doesn't give any indication there as to where his very pure water comes from, but I'm sure it doesn't come from an open tank of rainwater on the roof, but he very likely was using the water that came in naturally through the side walls of the deep quarry, coming straight out of the sandstone, which would have just been like filtered spring water. Anyway, that's just conjecture and we can't prove it. Moving on slightly, I'm going to throw in a few photographs just because I've got them and I can. This isn't really relevant to William Boote, but this is what Paddington looked like in later years. This photograph was taken in 1936, and we're looking up Paddington towards the top in St Mary's Church. Tram coming down there. And if you look closely, you can just see what I think must be the end wall of the set of Williamson buildings there, 120 to 126 Paddington. We don't have any photographs looking onto the front, as I've said before, but that's the closest we're probably going to get. And that very bad photocopy of a picture looking at number 120 that I showed earlier. I don't usually approve of colorized photos, but they're doing this rather well and doing it a lot nowadays. And this one, I think, has come out rather well. This is the same photograph, colorized, quite successful, I think. Looking up the street again from the top end of Brownlow Hill into Paddington in the 1950s. I think probably the area is becoming rather more run down by this time, but still very much the same, climbing the hill up Paddington there, and you can just see the church tower of St Mary's at the top there. There were always trams running down Paddington. It wasn't wide enough a street for two-way traffic. It went up Irvine Street, and the trams turned round at Holland Place and came down Paddington. And of course, this extended all the way down Brownlow Hill and right down to the Adelphi and Lewis's Corner at the bottom in the centre of the city. Now, William Boote, as I described earlier, was very keen on cats. And although he kept himself very busy in his retirement from 1905 onwards, he obviously wasn't that dedicated to work that he wanted to keep his businesses going, even though he'd been very successful. And maybe he found that working as a councillor provided more satisfaction for him, and he'd made his money. And he did a lot for the local people, obviously, but this little sideline of his was with cats. We know he retired and sold the business by 1905, but not exactly when. And he continued to be active as a councillor and in his charity work until the end of his life. Now, he died at the age of 77 in 1923, and his wife Fanny died in 1937 at the age of 2, and they both lived on at number 52 Dean Road until the end of their lives. Both of their cremated remains are interred at St Mary's Church, along with his first wife and his 2 children. But this is rather interesting. When Alderman William Boote of Liverpool died 10 years ago, this is a newspaper cutting, he left a sum of £12,000 in trust for his widow, with directions that on her death, the money was to be used to build a cat's home. Mrs. Boote died recently, and it is anticipated that very shortly the cat's home will be established. In his will, Alderman Boote set out his desires in detail. He asked that £1,000 should be set aside for the land and buildings, and that the home should be for stray cats, but the border cats could be admitted at a charge, and the home should be given by 3 trustees appointed by the public trustee. The alderman made cats a lifelong interest. It was his practice to carry pieces of cooked meat in his pocket and to feed any stray cat he met. At his home in Dean Road, Liverpool, he provided daily a substantial meal of tinned salmon and large quantities of fresh milk, which he put in his garden on plates and saucers for the cats. He bought a case of tinned salmon every day to provide this meal. In her widowhood, Mrs. Boote kept up the cat kindness, working in memory of her husband. It's a strange bequest, as most people would agree, but the man had made his money himself. He didn't have any children to leave his wealth to. He made sure his wife was well provided for, and he didn't make this bequest come into being until his wife had died. And it was carried through. And in fact, this is it. This is the William Boote Cat's Home for Stray Cats. And it actually opened in 1942 at number 2 Elm Vale in Fairfield, not very far away from where he lived in Dean Road. And it's now been running there for over 80 years. And it's as successful now as it was then, I think. The charity is obviously got enough money to keep itself going. And it's the longest running cat charity in Liverpool. I know that. It may have not many people, not many cats' homes that can rival it anywhere in the country, perhaps. But that's what he did, and that's his legacy, and that's William Boote. So a very successful businessman, but he didn't give his life entirely. He could have carried on working in his business establishments for the rest of his life if he wanted to. But really, I don't blame him for retiring from the business when he found it was not necessarily what he wanted to do for the rest of his life, and he did what he wanted. And he did a lot of good for the community and the local cats. So that's basically it. That is the story of our William Boote. And it was rather interesting the way his story is intertwined with the story of Joseph Williamson's buildings on Paddington. So we're glad to have had that connection, to know all about him and to find those remnants from his life there with bottles and things with the name William Boote on it. So thank you very much for watching. That's about all I've got to show you.